That Podcast Network and the It's Me Speaking to You podcast presents a podcast series for the archives. I talk to the producer and director of the Tupac assassination series, as well as the latest groundbreaking Docu series, Tupac Cover-Up. RJ Bond comes and talks about his many years researching and reporting on this case. And we will go episode by episode, breaking it all down. It has been way too long, and there are still way too many unanswered questions. Buckle up. You do not want to miss this. All right, here we go. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. What's cracking, everybody? We are back for another episode of the breakdown of the Tupac Cover-Up docuseries with the creator, producer, director, the man, the myth, the legend himself. RJ Bond is with us today. RJ, what's up, brother?
What's up? Greetings.
Wow. Awesome pre-show conversation, which we can't get into, but holy shit. But today we are focused on episode 3, The Great Diversion. Previously on Tupac Cover-Up, we ended up pretty much with the shooting had already happened. The chaos had ensued. The trying to put the pieces together from LAPD, Las Vegas is going down, and we pretty much ended with the Orlando Anderson and Vegas thing is not sticking, so if it doesn't stick on that, maybe they'll try to stick it to something else. Most notably, the hit on the Notorious B.I.G. Christopher Wallace. So we pick up episode 3 with the, like I said, trying to put these pieces together to what Frank Alexander begins this episode calling essentially a house of cards, a house of lies, layer after layer of lies. And all it takes is just one card to get pulled to, reduce that house of cards to rubble. But at the top of this house of cards was the Orlando Anderson theory. And we get into Michael Moore, man. He pretty much starts out after Frank alludes to the lies and the lies of lies. Michael Moore jumps in, starts talking about the meeting that they all had a few days after the shooting at Death Row or wherever it was, where they basically were asking the obvious question, what happened? What the fuck happened? And the crazy thing is, Michael Moore is saying, no one's speaking up, no one's saying anything. So he jumps in and says, guys, we were instructed not to have any weapons. And I find that so fascinating that nobody else knew that. None of the artists, I don't know if Suge necessarily knew, but everyone was in the dark on that order given to disarm all the bodyguards.
Well, we
Thoughts?
had, the great pretext. The episode 3 really tries to now look at what we call, the Great Diversion. What we look at is the split in the way that people are being fed information. And so what it looks like is that on the one hand, you have people from Death Row Records like Reggie Wright informing to Vegas PD, as we'll find out, as he likes to inform to a lot of people, apparently. But information is being fed to Vegas police, which are driving police towards the Orlando Anderson narrative. They're pushing everything they can to sell Vegas PD on this narrative. Meanwhile, they're telling Vegas PD, don't worry about our employees. Don't worry about Michael Moore. Don't worry about Frank Alexander. They really don't have anything to add. And of course, Vegas PD is using Reggie Wright Jr. as the liaison, being the alleged head of security for Death Row Records. They think that they can trust this guy. So they go ahead and they invest in him to be and I think it's kind of laziness too, that they use him to basically isolate. If you're an Orlando Anderson witness, or you've got information about Orlando Anderson, that gets to Vegas PD. If you've got anything else to add or anything else you want to say, Vegas PD isn't going to hear it, because we're not going to point you in that direction. Again, Reggie Wright telling Frank Alexander on the phone to not get subpoenaed,
Right.
which is against the law, by the way. And telling him don't whatever you don't get subpoenaed. He even told Michael Moore to tell Frank Alexander this.
Right.
There's more than one person telling Frank Alexander to basically stay away from this narrative, stay away from this case, don't give any information out, don't get any information out, and stick with the lies that you had already told, because it fits their narrative.
In,
Um,
in the recordings, Reggie was blatantly lying. He had said in official transcripts he, never said anything about the chain snatching. And he interviewed Jay Mix, I believe it was, where he had said he was like, "What I said not to get subpoenaed," and it's like, yeah, I
right.
mean, we've heard both contradicting stories, and it's all on record.
Right. And so yeah, but he's telling Frank, he's telling other people, like I said, you've got this division of interests where if you have something to add for the Orlando Anderson narrative, that's what they're selling to Vegas. Vegas is asking about other people, asking about Frank Alexander. They're not making these people available. Frank Alexander goes ahead and interviews with Vegas PD on his own. He calls Vegas PD and says, "Hey, listen, I lied to you about a lot of things, and it's really bugged me." And they
Mm,
said, "Well, do tell. What did you lie to us about?" And he goes on and talks about how this chain snatch never happened that day, and that he was told to lie to the cops about that chain snatch that day. So what this episode focuses on is it focuses on Reggie Wright Jr. as an informant for the FBI, for the LAPD. Greg Kading admitted as such,
yeah.
and arguably, for the Vegas PD, as he is apparently even still today.
Well, and
Uh,
to qualify his informant status, he pretty much says it was only limited to informing about, I believe it was the L.A. mayor or something like that. But
Crooked Compton Mayor Omar Bradley. Yeah, no,
okay,
but
yeah,
that's yeah, and
but
and of
he
course we straightened that out. That we weren't going to let that one go.
Well, and he knew about all of the other investigations that were going on at death row. He basically also said there was three or four or five other FBI informants there working for death row. One of which I believe was Kevin Hackey.
Are you
If
talking
you
about
don't
Phil Carson? Are you talking about Phil Carson, or who are you talking
know,
about?
I'm talking about the people who were working for death row, who were also not only former LAPD or LAPD active LAPD, but they're also FBI informants or ATF informants, federal
Well,
informants, basically.
yeah, it kind of here's how it went, and actually, a conversation that I had with Phil was very amusing. Phil said that they used to get a good chuckle, he and his buddies at the ATF and the DEA, and the obviously in the FBI, that they each had their own informants. So if a death row employee had a number, like employee number one through employee number 10, employee number one, three, five, and seven were ATF informants. Number two, three, and six were an FBI informants, and number eight and number 11 or whatever other number,
Right.
those were actually DEA informants. So each agency had their own informants within death row records, but none of the informants knew that the other informants were informing for a different agency.
Kind of
You,
compartmentalization a little bit.
you understand what I mean? And they got a good
Yeah.
chuckle out of that because every single one of them, every single person there, practically to the point where I actually asked Suge Knight, was there somebody working for you that wasn't an informant? Okay. Which he got
And
a
what did
good
he say
laugh
about
out
it?
of.
'Cause I know you talked to him
He
frequently.
says no, he said true point. He says, I don't know, it seems like it. And yeah, I mean that's that you kind of realize that the deck is really being stacked against you, even looking at it from Suge Knight's point of view,
Right.
because and again, this is not regarding Tupac per se. Let's make sure we're clear about that.
Right.
That the informing that was going on had to do with a RICO case, had to do with drugs operations, it had to do with firearms trading and arms trading.
Right.
It had to do with some very heavy duty substantive investigations, some substantive allegations. But this was all going on before Tupac ever got to death row.
Right.
So we're going
Right.
back to 1995. We're going back to 94. These are things that are ongoing and had absolutely nothing to do with Tupac.
Right.
So what we bring up in the documentary is that, this stuff had been going on for a long time, but Reggie Wright Jr. made it very clear to anybody who wanted to know that his intention from day one, not when Suge went to prison, but
Right.
from day one, was to take over Death Row Records. Okay.
Without a doubt. And
Yeah.
something that it's not the if it's a huge distinction, I don't know if you think it matters or not, but it was interesting to hear Phil break down the distinction of a type of FBI informant, which Reggie was. He was a 302. What's the significance of being a 302 as opposed to,
No, Reggie
well, I
was
forget the,
actually a ones. There are two. There's actually.
okay.
Let me get you right on that.
Absolutely.
There's 170 informants, And these come from actually from FBI field manual chapters. It's chapter 170 in their field manual, informant
Okay.
manual. A 170 informant is an informant. Let me double check to make sure I got the numbers right on that. Now I'm
Because
hang
I
on.
thought I heard Reggie say something like, "Come on, Phil, man, you see me in the 302s. Why don't you say
Well,
something to me about?"
a 302 is the form number for an informant report.
Okay,
When they
okay,
get a statement from an informant. So you have a 270 informant, and a 270 informant it only gives information to the FBI when they're incentivized. So a 270 informant would be somebody like that's trying to work off 5 years off their sentence, or
right,
trying to get an early release, or trying to get off, get a reduced sentence or something like that. That's a 270 informant. And then you have what we call the 137 informant. The 137 informant is somebody that would be like a Russ Poole, that would give information voluntarily to the FBI, because they know what's happening isn't right, and they do that. So it would be an arguable claim that Reggie Wright Jr. was a 137 informant, because he really wasn't working off. They hadn't charged him with anything.
right,
They may have implied, and I don't know what pressure tactics they used. If they had been a Greg Kading, they would have certainly implied that he was, that they were going to put him in a box, so to speak, to make him a 270 informant, to make him do something to work off, because that's what they did with Keefe D. Keefe D was effectively a 270 informant for the LAPD. Greg Kading in his book, and we'll get into this in the next chapter of the movie, but Greg Kading said in his book that when they built the PCP drug case against Keith Davis, uh, and sent in informants and spent a bunch of DEA money in that to get Keefe D on the PCP charge, that they had no intention of charging him with the drug charges. That the only reason that they got him caught on those violations was to get him to cooperate and give them information about the Tupac case. Which, when you think about it, that's the dumbest logic I've ever heard in my life. But it says a lot that you're going to spend. Do you think any of those other cops thought that they were spending DEA money and they were running all these informants and everything else to not have an arrest and a conviction on the drug case?
right.
I mean, do you really think that everybody bought into that? That we're going to go put Keefe D and spend all these resources and all this taxpayer money on a drug dealer to not charge him?
Doesn't
But
make
that's in
sense.
fact what happened. They didn't charge him,
Right.
and Greg Kading used that pressure, or that thing hanging over his head, to make him a 270 informant, because that he, in Keefe D's mind, he thought he was working off a potential charge. Had it been me, I would have said, charge me, and then we've got something to talk about. Because Kading said in his book that they had no intention of charging Keith Davis for that crime.
Why do you think in initially, why do you think they even approached Keefe to have any deal if he had absolutely if he wasn't in Vegas or if he had nothing to do with the Tupac? Why would they have just picked him out of anybody to lean on him to create this narrative?
Well, I think it's clear, because everybody else was dead. The Keefe D was the uncle of Orlando Anderson,
That's
who
true.
was
Yeah, everyone was
accused of
dead.
being the shooter. And from the minute that the documentary kind of points this out, that from the minute that Greg Kading's task force takes over after all these years, and they want to go take it out a new door and try to find out some radical new theory about what happened in the Tupac case, the first thing they do is, within 2 months, they're jumping right back into the Orlando Anderson did it camp. And that
Right.
was because Tim Brennan was part of Greg Kading's task force. So and Tim Brennan, for everybody who hasn't been following along, it was a former Compton PD officer who authored the Orlando Anderson shot Tupac narrative. So we're clear on that.
With
Uh,
Bobby Ladd, right? With
yeah, that was Tim Brennan, and his partner was Bobby Ladd.
yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, with Bobby Ladd, I meant.
With
Yeah.
Bobby Ladd. Yep. So anyway, long story short, they're already stuck on this Orlando Anderson narrative, but they have no proof, because nobody's had any proof that Orlando Anderson did it for, almost 20 years at that point, because it was 2006. So, it's 10 years later. No proof. So how do you get anything? Well, ultimately, Keefe D was a drug dealer. They knew he was a drug dealer. and they knew that he could co-sign the story that Orlando Anderson did it because he put himself in the car with Orlando Anderson. Okay. Now, Mr. Kading says that they trumped up all these charges against Keefe D so that he would quote unquote tell the truth. Okay. Well, that's presuming that you believe that Keefe D was in the car. And in spite of what Greg Kading has said, and I have Russell Poole's files from the investigations there. Okay. Keith Davis's name did not come up over and over again, like Kading wrote in his book, that Keith Davis's name kept coming up over and over again in the investigation. They looked at him one time for that he had an SS that matched the description of a vehicle that may have been used in the Biggie killing. He had one of those cars. Of course, everybody did in those days. It was an SS. So everybody had one. And they went and looked at it, did a search warrant on his house, raided his house. That was the end of it. They cleared him, didn't have anything to do with it. Done. So that was it. It didn't keep coming up over and over again. So you got to really ask yourself this question about who engineered Keith Davis's involvement
Yeah.
in the Tupac case. Because, obviously they didn't just come and tell him, and again, the idea that they bring him in for questioning and they ask him about the Biggie case, and then he just suddenly says, "No, but I got something better for you than that. How about I was involved with the Tupac case?"
Right, right.
Really? Yeah, it doesn't, again, not it defies about anybody that's got an IQ of about 50. It defies thinking because, number one, no drug dealer that's been in and out of jail is going to automatically just say, "I'm not going to give you that, but I'm going to give you this."
Right, right.
Okay, number one, and then be honest about it. One of the things about Keefe D that this doesn't make any sense to me, and it doesn't make a sense to a lot of people, is where his name came up of. Kading does short work in his book and says, "Well, the name Keefe D came up over and over again in the investigation." No, because I've seen Russ Poole's police files, and Keith Davis was not involved in that investigation. His name didn't keep coming up over and over again. Certainly didn't come up in the Tupac case over and over again. So it really kind of makes you question why Keith Davis, how he even got involved in this, how he was even introduced into
Right.
the conversation, other than the fact that he was, in fact, Orlando Anderson's uncle. So,
Well, and one of those crucial elements, like we've spoken about already, when you want to maintain a false narrative, obviously the media is a huge component. And then you enter, we've mentioned him already, but enter Chuck Phillips, who was on death row's payroll, who was a Pulitzer Prize winner, which gave credibility to some of his assertions. But he was the one who was starting to double down on the possible big Puff did it and just steering everybody away from obviously what was the truth.
yes, I mean, and that was the thing, and of course, even the Shakur family, believed what Chuck Phillips said because of his reputation and because he had, been a guy who had been a kind of an entertainment reporter, Hollywood beat reporter who got involved with Death Row Records and realized that it was a very mutual, satisfactory relationship that he would get the scoops from George Price at Death Row Records, George Price being the publicist for Death Row Records, and he would do that and he'd put them on LA Times and it would get a lot of traction and get a lot of news. But then, of course, the infamous retraction where Chuck Phillips relied on a guy by the name of James Sabatino, who was a known forger, that he forged a bunch of FBI, those 302 documents that we were just talking about, the FBI form number for an informant, and he forged a bunch of FBI 302 forms. Chuck Phillips fell for it, and the forms and the alleged FBI informant said that Biggie was actually in Las Vegas the night that Tupac was shot, and that Biggie provided the weapon to have Tupac killed. Okay. And Phillips fell for it. And there was a lot of he ran with it all the way up the line to the LA Times, and Wallace family made such a big stink about it that the LA Times had to publish a retraction. And for a newspaper, that's a big thing to do,
That's
a
a big deal.
retraction. Yeah, it's a big
Yeah.
deal. So Chuck Phillips was kind of disgraced at that point. He ended up dying very alone. He died not just too recently, about maybe 6 months ago.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was kind of hiding. We don't know what his circumstances were. We don't know why he was hiding or who he was hiding from, but he had a very, for as big as he lived life and for as much of the Hollywood scene that he covered and the entertainment record industry scene that he covered, he was very well known, and he died a very reclusive death. So,
Mm.
kind of, you can infer what you will from that,
Yeah, yeah.
but it definitely says a lot to the how the mighty fall. That's for
Well,
sure.
and then this conversation with Phil, with Reggie, disclosing, hey, dude, come on, you were an informant. I'm just wondering, man, just watching Reggie do what he does. Why is he so comfortable? I think speaking so recklessly. I mean,
Oh,
what are your,
well,
well, and then
yeah.
because in the recording you could hear it's not muffled, but he's just like, he says to Phil, he's like, I'm not because. Phil's like, come on, I'm trying to protect you. Shut the fuck up, Reggie. He's like, I'm not worried about it. And he said something like, it's obvious, and he doesn't really say anything, and then he's like, come on now, almost like he's got this like untouchable. He's like, I can say whatever the fuck I want, nobody's coming after me because I'm ensconced with basically this LAPD criminal organization that no one's really gonna touch because of how systemic it is, the $1 billion lawsuit with Valletta Wallace, etc. It's like, I don't think they're ever really gonna come at Reg like that because he knows, like he says, I know too fucking much.
Well, I think that, again, if you look at, first off, let's look at the reckless things that he says. Most of his responses, when you look at when he does his live shows that, a handful of people watch, and he does his nasty, nasty business, 90% of what his threats are is informing. I'm going to go
Right.
tell this person, or I'm going to go tell this one, or I know something about you. I know something about you. I've got
Yeah.
some dirt on you. But what's the threat? If you're holding dirt on somebody, the only threat you have is that you're going to tell someone else that dirt. Okay. That's your leverage. But what's the threat? The threat's I'm going to inform. I'm going to inform on you. Who to? It could be the FBI. It could be the cops. It could be another gang. It could be death row. It could be I'm going to inform somebody about this secret that I have about you. And that's how he works. And so it's funny to not picture him, or to picture him as not an informant, because everything he does is run, go, tell. Okay, everything he does, run, go, tell. I'm going to tell this person. Oh, I'm going to tell. Well, I know too much about you guys and this, that, and the other. And I'm if that stuff ever came out and blah blah blah. But I'm no
Right.
snitch. Okay, right. But I'm no snitch. So it is fascinating. I had a very candid conversation in the third episode with Don Sikorsky, who was the producer of City of Lies. Great guy. Done a lot of work in the Biggie case, obviously, with City of Lies being the portrayal of Russell Poole by Johnny Depp. Good movie. Um, you know, Don also was the one of the producers on a show for Fox that covered the Biggie case, and they interviewed Reggie Wright for that case. And Don was surprised that when they interviewed Reggie Wright and he was telling them what he didn't wanted to say and what he didn't want to say, he was kind of playing some cagey games with them. That when they broke from camera, um, Reggie had to go throw up in his bathroom
Yeah.
because he was so upset about you know being put on the spot and having to try to talk his way out of it. Did not fool Ice T for a minute. He goes, "That's dry snitching." Definitely didn't fool Ice T.
Well,
But
no, I've Don, I had the pleasure. All this kind of ball started rolling with me, with you guys. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Don, thanks to John Agonopoulos and a couple of people hooking that up. And he did. He was the showrunner and producer. Soledad O'Brien and Ice T did the interviewing. And I'm no body behavioral analysis, but you could just see that Reggie's like the worst liar, obviously, but his body just is such a huge tell in some of his mannerisms, his movements. And I thought that was very interesting that he was so put on the spot that he goes and throws up in the bathroom.
well, yeah, and and to get back to your question, one of the things that we bring up later, but I guess we can talk about a little bit about now because we've got a lot we can talk about when the other shows air too. But Phil brought up a great point that if you look at the case of a Whitey Bulger, for example, which is what
Yeah.
I compare Reggie Wright to as a modern day Whitey Bulger. Once you have the ear of the FBI, there are a lot of informants who get kind of a God complex that whatever it is trouble they get into, that the FBI will help get them out of that trouble because they're worth more to the FBI for who they hang out with and what they know versus how dirty they get their hands. And that certainly was the case with Whitey Bulger, who became close to the FBI agents, and they ended up feeding him information, and he was having his own guys killed, and competitors killed because of information that he was getting from the FBI. So when you if you've got good information to give to the FBI, you have a certain target value
Yeah.
to you, and I'm sure they do help you get out of things. And again, the FBI's job, and especially back in the death row days when Reggie was, before Suge went to jail or before Tupac and the whole killing thing, that I'm sure he had a lot of value to the FBI because of the position that he was in and who he rubbed elbows with.
Yeah.
So I'm sure he had a lot of valuable information. And of course, the FBI is going to do everything they can to keep him in that position.
Right.
Unfortunately, the mistake a lot of these cats make as they get older is they think they still have that same level of protection and that same level of um, uh,
The same
get out of
juice, that
jail.
same swag.
Yeah,
Like, I mean, it's
yeah,
just,
get out of jail free card, type of
yeah,
thing.
yeah, yeah.
And so that has over the years emboldened him to do some bad acts and say some bad things because in the back of his pea-brained mind, he thinks that he's got some sort of immunity or some sort of a bigger hand protecting him
Well, an era of
than he really
protection, and it
does.
seems like it's kind of been working because here we are. I mean, everyone kind of, it's very circumstantial. We all know that he had some dealings with this, and even if he doesn't have any relevant information now, he can go back to the feds and be like, "You guys better keep me protected," because, like you said, not only am I know everything about the cats I'm working with as far as death row and criminals and gangs and shit. Like, I know FBI, ATF, what you guys have all been doing. Like, I mean, he almost knows too much. I interviewed John McAfee. I'm sorry, not to divert, but I interviewed John McAfee years ago before he died, and he's like, they have to kill me because I know fucking everything. My stuff was in every computer in the 1990s. So, I mean, I think it just seems like he still has that kind of hedge of protection, low these many years later, even though his hands are clearly in so much in this. It kind of leads me to my next point about where we go in the movie. Michael Moore starts putting these pieces together and makes the revelation of, like, you know what? I think this Tupac death is related to us. Seeing what I saw in New York, the altercation with Suge Knight, seeing the fight between, like I said, between Pac and Suge the week before the shooting, when you heard "Got Him," he's just putting these obvious pieces together.
Yeah, he clearly doesn't think, regardless of what direction you want to take that down the line, he definitely puts it out there that he doesn't believe it's Orlando Anderson. He doesn't believe it's the narrative that is, and at the time that his interview was done was 2002. So that's what, 8 years later, or no, that's my math is bad. 6 years later, even 6 years after the fact, he's not buying the outsider gang gang narrative. And and it falls apart under its own weight. I mean,
Right.
as it was pointed out to me not just a few days ago, when you look at even Keefe D's story about how he got a gun, the Zip gave him a gun to go shoot Tupac, and that, let's break that down for a minute. Okay? Let's just apply RJ math to the problem for a minute. Okay? You got an entourage of 25 at minimum, 25 members of death row that are part of the death row entourage who inevitably will end up at Club 662 to some degree or another. Had the shooting not happened, of course, they would have all been there. So you have 25 guys. Out of those 25 guys, a few of them were told by Reggie Wright to not carry any weapons. And maybe they listened, or maybe, like in the case of Michael Moore, they didn't. But how many other guys do you think that were in that entourage that were gangbanger guys, that were death row followers like a Buntry and like everybody else that was there? How many, let's just, and I'm using a swag of 25, could have been a lot more. But let's just say 25. Out of 25, what percentage of those guys do you think would be carrying weapons?
A lot.
Let's just guess.
Yeah,
Let's
a
say half.
lot. Yeah.
Okay, we'll say half. So you got 12 guys that are armed out of 25. Now, I'm Keefe D, or I'm Orlando Anderson, and I'm going to go take on 12 or more armed guys, and I bring one gun. I mean, think about that for a minute. I mean,
Yeah.
that's huge because the story that they want you to believe is that they went to Club 662 looking for Suge Knight and Tupac, which means you are going to the OK Corral and you are calling out Doc Holliday.
Yeah.
Okay? You're going there and with one gun and you're going to their house where there could be cops, there could be lots of guys, gang guys, lots of armed guys, and your bright idea is to show a force with one gun.
Yeah.
How stupid is that? I mean, just on its face,
Yeah.
how dumb is that? Number one. So that's why it doesn't even make any sense to anybody with common sense regarding gang operations, just generally speaking. How in the world, why in the world would you think what are your odds of success if you've got one gun and there's 12 guys shooting back at you? Okay, what are your odds of success? You know, the shooting happened and the shooting surprised them. And that's why they didn't have a chance to respond. But you know, depending who you talk to, there were some people they say that fired back. Okay, you with me?
Yeah.
So that happened and that was a surprise. And if you're going to go and look and surprise somebody, that's one thing. But when you're talking about driving to Club 662 where they all hang out, isn't that kind of like parachuting into the Nazi camp?
Right. Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
with one gun and
The
you're going to
belly
go
of the
take them
beast.
all on? I mean, what are
Yeah.
you, Bruce Willis and Die Hard at this point?
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
Keefe Die Hard. And so he goes so you hear this story and when you start to break it down, it's like it doesn't even make any sense on its face. But
Mm.
this is the narrative that they keep wanting to pump to Vegas. And of course, again, you know, who's the first person you call? If you're Vegas or anybody starting an investigation, you reach out to the people that you think would be the first ones that would know something about it. And that's always Reggie Wright. He's made himself known, he's made himself available. He's the guy that they can talk to first. And why would you do that? Would you do that because there's a narrative you want to protect? Not
Right.
because you're a great guy, not because you want to be known as a snitch or you want it out there that you're a snitch, but sometimes you have to make that sacrifice because that's what protects your narrative.
Well, not everybody enter Frank now recanting his story and not going along with that official narrative, and we move into um they start to realize that around the time of Suge's appeal in April of 1998, they start realizing that Orlando is also not going to play ball. And this was around the same time, March or April
Yeah.
1998.
I mean,
And
think
then
about,
Orlando is killed literally May the next month.
yeah,
And the first person on the scene, Reggie Wright Sr., oddly enough. Thoughts on
imagine
that?
that. Yeah, imagine that, as he says. Um, you know, imagine being Orlando Anderson for a minute. Okay, these guys haven't retaliated against you for 2 years, which, and they've not only that, but they paid you off to say that Suge was helpful in the altercation. Okay.
Right.
But on the other side of things, so they're playing nice to Orlando Anderson, but on the other side of the world, they're running around behind his back telling Vegas that he's the murderer, that he's a murderer, that he's a murderer.
Right.
Kind of like what they're doing with Keith Davis now and what they did with that. You know, going back to the Darren Dupree and Greg Kading thing, how interesting is it to me that on the one hand they're doing full page runs in the Sun, the UK Sun, where Greg Kading is pleading law enforcement to arrest Keith Davis. Meanwhile, they're arranging $100,000 interviews for Keith Davis on BET. I mean, think about that. What are the
Yeah.
optics there? Okay, if you really think that this guy's such a bad guy and that he needs to be arrested and charged and thrown in prison for the rest of his life, why are you enriching him? Why are you going around making him money?
Got to
Why are
reinforce
you
that bullshit narrative.
well, there you go. And again, because he has to co-sign on it.
Well, and going
So,
back to the day, I'm sorry, going back to the day Orlando was killed, apparently in
right,
the file is this another officer, Ray Richardson, who's apparently saying he got a dying confession from Orlando Anderson that he killed Tupac. What the
yeah, I
fuck?
killed Tupac.
Yeah.
The thing about the again, but imagine being Orlando Anderson. they're being nicey nice to him and telling him, paying him off and doing all this kind of thing and leaving him alone because nobody went after him. But on the other side of the fence, you discover, hey, wait a minute, these guys are trying to hang me for the murder in Vegas
Right.
because now Vegas is ramped up, and then there was the raids, and he asked Brent Becker, "Are you going to arrest me?" Brent Becker says, "Arrest you for what?" Because Becker's not convinced he's the guy. The evidence just isn't there for it. It's just a lot of cops trying to push that narrative, and so he does that. But then as you get into towards 98 time frame, suddenly the heat and the call out for Orlando Anderson to be arrested is getting stronger and stronger. And there's a sense that because there's a civil suit going on, the wrongful death suit from the Shakur family. There's talk where he finally wakes up and realizes, hey, wait a minute, somebody's trying to hang me for murder here, and it's the
Right.
same clowns that offered me the money to testify on Suge's behalf. So suddenly you see Orlando Anderson showing up on CBS and doing an interview with Stephanie Fredericks. You see him, the video of the deposition of him. He's becoming much more vocal. He's saying now he's self-advocating. I didn't do it. I didn't do it. They're saying I did it. I didn't do it. I'm telling you I didn't do it. Nobody's arrested me. I've gone 2 years. Nobody said a word about it. There's no evidence that I did. I haven't done it. Well, when he gets to that point and they want to approach him again about helping Suge Knight out in his appeal of his probation violation case, which he got a court date for, um, they get it in May. They get it in April. They get the approval for a June 15th court date, and then at the end of May, 2 weeks before the court date, Orlando Anderson is killed. My suspicion was that Orlando Anderson wasn't going to go along with the bribe again at that point to pay him off to say things about it, because here they were paying him off, saying that he's doing a great thing, et cetera, et cetera. They go to pay him off. On the other hand, they're trying to hang him for murder.
And he was recorded in 1998 deposition saying, he wasn't
Yeah,
playing ball, never been in a white Cadillac, never knew anybody who had a white
right.
Cadillac, etc.
Yep.
But I mean, a lot of this again, it seems to me pretty obvious from a circumstantial standpoint because that's a lot of, I mean, obviously when you're kind of a mastermind of something like this, you want to create all the plausible deniability as possible so the finger can't
Sure.
be pointed directly at you. But something that I think Reggie and right way security, if you will, could be, and I'm surprised it hasn't happened. You discuss it in this criminal negligence. He
Right.
created this environment that this would take place between the removal of comms and the radios, between the disarming them. He had what you call in this episode a duty of care for
Right.
his clients, and he completely was negligent in his basic duty of care of doing his job of protecting these guys, whether it was the guns, whether it was the communications. Talk to me about the possibility. I mean, I don't even know if it's still possible. Criminal negligent
No,
case against
unfortunately,
Reggie.
yeah, unfortunately, no. I think at this point, you could theoretically argue that the statute of limitations, which is usually only a few years,
Okay.
that statute might be told or actually extended based on what they call the discovery rule, which means that somebody's finally discovered information that they didn't know in the past. And once you discover that information, that kind of resets the statute of limitations. And I think
Mm.
that that's always something that even civilly could be hanging over, somebody's head, because even though the Shakur estate in all their infinite wisdom, and I say that with a wink and a nod because they've made some rather unusual decisions, in my opinion, about the way they've managed his death and the investigation and all that. When when they sued Death Row Records for the wrongful death lawsuit, and they sued Orlando Anderson with the wrongful death lawsuit, they didn't name Right Way Security, nor did Death Row
Ah.
Records ever try to dismiss out and leave Right Way Security as the responsible entity, because that's how it usually goes. Death Row Records was a separate company from Right Way Security. Right Way Security and the security guards were not Death Row Records employees. They were an entirely separate company to which Right Way would have had E&O insurance. They would have had to have liability insurance. Obviously, when you're doing a security company, you've got a heightened level of responsibility to your clients. And so you would have that insurance. And interestingly enough, the Shakur family and their attorneys weren't savvy enough to understand that, and they just went ahead
Mm,
and sued Death Row Records, and then Death Row Records didn't didn't want to get dismissed out because I think even Death Row Records had some liability, and I don't think they could have pushed it all off on Right Way, but
right.
Right Way themselves should have been sued, and arguably, even though it's many, many years later, if there was some new incriminating evidence that would prove that there's an old saying, known or should have known, that they use
Right.
in lawsuits, that you either knew something or you should have known something. And in this particular case, if they didn't have guns and they didn't have, radios, which is the most important of communications, if they
Right.
didn't have this, they knew there was a reasonable expectation that Reggie Wright knew or should have known that there would be trouble or that there could be difficulties, especially after a beating at the MGM and the whole thing.
Right.
So all of the things favor a criminal negligence, but we're not talking about now. But you go back to the from 5 minutes after the shooting, that's very much a possibility. There could be criminal negligence or charges filed against them for their role or lack thereof in either creating the situation that had happened or failing to uh, obviate it to get to make it not happen. Um, Either way, there could have been severe criminal liability, criminal negligence there. I mean, like I said, we used the Rust, the TV, the movie Rust with Alec Baldwin.
Yeah.
The set or armor, put live rounds in a fake gun, and somebody died. And even though he was kind of let off on a technicality, before the technicality, and there was prosecutorial misconduct, it really wasn't a technicality. The prosecutors got overzealous. They were hiding documents. Well, Alec Baldwin was, as the producer of that, they were looking at him for liability in that. So Suge Knight, under that same theory, Suge Knight would have been just as liable
Right.
as Reggie Wright in that. So clearly, there's an effort on both parties' parts to want to drive everything away, just like a
Yeah.
fly repellent, just push everything away that would get anywhere near the theory that Death Row had anything to do with it at all. And I'm not saying anybody from Death Row pulled the trigger.
Right.
That's not the point. The point is that Death Row had such a lack of responsibility and a lack of care that they almost created that situation.
Well, and you hear in the conversation between Michael Moore and Frank Alexander, and this was, I think, 97, not too long after the shooting, they're like, they
Right?
just didn't care about security for Tupac. They just didn't give a fuck.
No.
And, as Reggie further goes to obfuscate the truth and try to, minimize like the meeting at George Colessi's office and the disarming, he tells allhiphop.com that there was never any bodyguard meeting that they were told to disarm. So he's
Yeah.
obviously, very good at talking out of both sides of his neck. But here's another example.
Yeah, he's had more than his share over the years of, of bites at the apple in terms of readdressing certain facts that happened during the case, historical facts. And it amazes me that pick the day you get a different story,
Yeah.
or a different version of
When
it.
as he says, I played both sides. You know it. You know I play. I'm like shit like that, like a blatant admission. Like I say whatever the fuck I want. I play both sides. Like, dude,
Yeah.
do
Well,
better.
yeah. Well, the way I play both sides is that, I bullshit the crooks and I bullshit the cops. I
Right.
play both
Yeah.
sides.
Well,
And
and another
yeah,
aspect of anomalous behavior, according to people who were around him a lot, Michael Moore and Frank, all of those guys said Reggie was never, ever at Club 662. Never. And he
right.
insisted on being there that night. And
He
when
did.
Reggie and kind of Frank asked himself, like, what did he do different that night? Like, nothing. He just made sure he was there.
Right. You know, Reggie, it's funny that you talk about that the Michael Moore and Frank Alexander were commenting that Reggie goes to Club 662. What different did he do? He did nothing. Uh the From what I understand from many different people that were there and some other documents that I've had, is that this was supposed to be the first night, ironically, that Tammy Hawkins was supposed to be officially running the club. And I'm going to sneeze here, so forgive me if I sneeze. Um, but the Tammy Hawkins was going to be running the club. And I think, there's this weird, undefined, special relationship between Tammy Hawkins and Reggie Wright. Okay.
And who was Tammy Hawkins again? Just to qualify.
Yeah, Tammy Hawkins was one of Suge's baby mamas. Okay. And she came on the scene largely known for having one of Suge's kids. And she was a member of the Hawkins family. And the Hawkins family and Jerry Hawkins were big drug dealers in the Compton
Mm.
area. In fact, when Greg Kading was interviewing Keith Davis under their alleged proffer session, the case name was Jerry Hawkins. Okay. So you've got Tammy Hawkins who's related to Jerry Hawkins, and you've got this whole incestuous thing with drug dealing in Compton, and it seems like everybody's hands are dirty.
Mhm.
And Tammy Hawkins was given by Suge. Suge wanted her to have a role in his organization, and as such, she was set up to be the general manager of Club 662, and that was how she was going to remain. That was basically going to be her station going forward. That was her job, that was her responsibility, and Suge could make sure that he knew somebody, could trust somebody that was working there that would run it for him. But she had never run a nightclub before, and again, like we talked about last week, there were all kinds of problems with the liquor license and Suge Knight and having to get special event permits for all of that. So it was looking like they were going to have more frequent special events at Club 662, so long as that one went well and then the one after that went well and they could make a thing out of it. Every time Club 662 were to be open, Tammy Hawkins was supposed to be managing it. Okay. And that comes from Art Gemelli. That comes from a lot of people that were actually there. And more importantly, it comes from the Las Vegas Clark County Liquor Administration report on Club 662. They went in and they did a club check audit, and they audited everybody that had a card. You have to have a special card to work at a bar in Nevada, and especially in Clark County. And they looked at everybody and they checked out. And in this report, they actually detail what this person's role was. And Tammy Hawkins was, everybody said that she was supposed to take over running Club 662. So I think, and again, Reggie Wright having a relationship with Tammy Hawkins, it, I don't believe what Reggie has said about Tammy Hawkins and their relationship. I mean, I've got paperwork from an eviction where Reggie Wright and Tammy Hawkins were evicted from the same house. Okay.
Mm.
And Reggie says, "Well, I just rented that house from her for her, or rented it on behalf of Suge." Yeah, okay. But again, and then that's when he made the allegation that Suge Knight had the clap and that, or syphilis or some other VD, and that he wouldn't get involved with Tammy Hawkins because he believed that Suge Knight gave her some VD, which I'm surprised neither one of them sued him over that to begin with. But he put that out there. And but Tammy Hawkins was also the one that Greg Kading, called Teresa Swan in his book, and was the one who,
Okay, that's who that is. I've listened when I was listening to Reggie. I would hear this name, Teresa Swan. I'm like, who the fuck? Who are they? Who are they talking about? So
yeah,
okay,
well, Greg Kading gets the award for the worst pseudonyms on the planet in terms of fake names. Uh, you know, Tammy Hawkins,
Teresa
Teresa
Swan.
Swan. Yeah, a lot of brain power there. I mean, I bet a whole 30 seconds of thought went into that one. Um,
Oh shit.
but yeah, so that's how that all fits together. But I
So
think
are
that
you, I mean, I'm saying I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is there kind of an intimation that you're saying like Reggie had some affiliation with Suge's baby mama?
yeah, I think so. Well, let me put it this way. I don't think there was anything of Suge's that Reggie didn't want.
Okay.
If
I
Suge
just
got it, if Suge had it, Reggie wanted it.
I
Okay.
just find it interesting because, and I don't know how much we'll get
Allegedly.
into him if we get it. Yes, allegedly, but that's not Reggie messing with one of Suge's girls. Isn't the only one that was messing with one of Suge's girls. But I don't know how much we'll get into him. Kevin Gaines, LAPD officer,
Well,
supposedly
right. Yeah.
smashing on Sharitha Knight, who's apparently has a possible role in this as well. So that's interesting. I didn't know that that was a possible association
Yeah,
between.
and it's pretty common thought by most of the people that were around that the only reason that Reggie Wright was actually at Club 662 and not actually with Suge Okay, because most of the time, to Michael Moore and Frank Alexander's comments, he wasn't usually around the club. He was usually with Suge. He was usually in the background, either I won't say bodyguarding because I can, but just as part of the entourage or Suge's right hand guy, whatever you want to call him. He
Yeah.
was with Suge. This weekend, he wasn't with Suge because Tammy Hawkins, the training wheels were coming off of her running the register at Club 662. So Reggie had to be there, kind of the reassuring hand, so to speak, for Tammy
Okay.
Hawkins there. That's what I've heard. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but that's what I've heard. I've heard that he had a very cozy relationship with Tammy Hawkins, and that's, by the way, that's how Greg Kading got Tammy Hawkins, was through Reggie Wright. Okay.
Reggie just giving everybody up.
Uh-huh. Well, that's what happens when you get involved. That's
Well, and it leads me to my next point, which is interesting because as we wind down episode 3, Reggie's talking to his boy Kevin Hackey, again, former LAPD, also a federal informant, basically saying to him, I'm too far in, Kevin. Reggie's saying to Kevin, I'm too far in. You just
right.
don't even know. And I mean, they didn't really get too much more into that, but I mean, it sounds like Reggie's in. I don't know if it's deeper than he wants to be, but he's in deep.
Yeah, and we asked the question, too far into what? Is he too far in as
Right.
an informant?
Right.
Is he too far in with the narrative? What's he too far in? Is he drank the Kool-Aid that is the Death Row Records Suge Knight Kool-Aid? Did he really think that he had crossed the Rubicon and that he was another Suge Knight? When he says I'm too far in. Um, there were people that said Reggie Wright got red carpet in his house. Okay. And I think it was Kevin that said that, actually told me that Reggie got
I mean,
red
with
carpet
how
in his
he's
house.
been moving in this certain level, I mean, obviously, God has touched him in other ways with his karmic business. But I mean, as far as being a free man and staying alive, a lot of these people have died around him and have been incarcerated. Like Reggie, who's so deeply into this, is walking around as a free dude, and he's obviously and his associates are again way deeper in this. And I think, man, I don't know. I think Don or Johnny was saying something about Netflix is supposed to be doing a Rampart series. I think this Rampart series, if done well, and this I have no evidence to prove this, but I think this was way more ubiquitous than just David Mack bank robbery. I mean, I think this was a freaking criminal syndicate that was running the streets
Well,
of. And
actually,
again, I could be wrong. And the reason I'm saying this is
well,
because
it's interesting you mentioned that. Go ahead and finish your thought. I
well,
got
I
to
was just gonna. I
on
wanted
that.
to bring up the significance of Kenneth Knox. Kenneth Knox is the one who gave once he found out Russell Poole was investigating the Gaines murder and found out the revelation of LAPD officers working for Death Row. Those two linked up, and when Kenneth Knox went to his superiors, they're like, "Bro, we know all of this. Shut the fuck up, or we'll ruin your life." Type thing. Same thing they did to Russell Poole. So I'm
Well,
just saying
yeah,
this. This
Ken
sounds like
Knox.
this is a very far-reaching criminal syndicate and organization beyond just the stuff we know.
Well, I hope they don't do a Rampart show. I hope they don't do a Rampart show because honestly, what's come of that is that one guy, Rafael Perez, lied about so many officers and made this big story
Mm,
about, and again, it's to try to dilute his participation in it. If you got 1,000 cops doing it and you're one of 1,000, you can make the argument, well, I wasn't doing anything else that anybody else wasn't doing, and they're worse than I am. But as
right.
as the layers started to get peeled away, which kind of leads us to Ken Bogney, as the layers start to get peeled away, it becomes more and more clear that almost none of the officers that Ray Perez actually tried to blame for bad acts actually did the bad acts.
Did I
That
say? I'm sorry. Did I say Kenneth Boagny? I was talking about Kenneth Cox, the former 16-year veteran of LAPD.
No, I was talking about Ken Bogney. Ken
Okay, I'm
Bogney
sorry.
was the one who was used by the LAPD's Board of Rights to
Yes,
basically dispel most of the lies that Ray Perez had told about acts of other cops on
and
the
they were cellmates
LAPD.
together. That's how he knew this
Right.
information.
And the amazing thing about it was it turns out that Rampart, for as big of a name as it became and such a bad name and the shield based on it and all that, it's interesting to me that these guys, it was the fantasy of one guy. There was a couple of bad cops, but they tried to make it look like everybody was bad and that this whole Rampart division was bad and corrupt, and it just wasn't. Kent Knox, on the other hand, was an interesting story simply because he stumbled across, he wasn't even in LA. He was up in a place called the San Fernando Valley, which is actually 20 miles north of downtown Los Angeles. You have to go over the mountain to get to it or go over the hills to get to it. And that was where Death Row Records Can-Am Studios, the recording studio, was, not their corporate office. Corporate office was in Hollywood, but their or West LA. But their recording studio was actually in the San Fernando Valley. Ken Knox was stationed. He was what they call an SLO, which is a law enforcement officer,
Senior
and
lead officer, yeah.
lean officer. Thank you. And there's only one in each division of the LAPD. Each police station only has one. So he's not a captain or anything like that, but he's actually kind of the top of the rank and file. And he was called over complaints by the rich people that lived around that neighborhood in Tarzana, that there were just a lot of guys hanging out in the parking lots making a lot of noise and fighting, and they didn't like that they were very uncomfortable because that area is largely gentrified. A lot of the multi-story condo units and all that. So you get a lot of it's a small industrial area that's kind of tucked into a large residential area. So of course people are getting upset about it. Well, that's when Knox started looking into it, and he had several meetings, including with Suge Knight and including with Death Row Records attorney David Kenner and a couple other people, and noticed when he was at Can-Am that there were LAPD officers working there, that he recognized them, he knew who they were, and that he made a report about it. But to your point, LAPD just said, yeah, okay, so it's a day that ends in Y. And that was it. That was as far as it went. Russ Poole believed that the well went much deeper than that. And again, and you have to kind of give it at what point of time this was. Russ's judgment was heavily influenced by what Ray Perez was saying at the time, okay, which hadn't been dispelled yet. If he'd been on 5 more years and saw that most of what Ray Perez had to say, would Russ have been as strong an advocate for corrupt cops working for death row? Well, we already know they were. I've got the list of who these guys were, all of them. Inglewood
Well, I
cops,
mean, and that's
Compton
kind of what I
cops.
was saying. It was
Yeah,
more possibly more ubiquitous than what we think, because even Chief Bernard Parks admitted it about David
yeah,
Mack and Rafael Perez, and
yep.
David Mack was personally recruited by Chief Bernard Parks out of the University of Oregon.
Hmm.
I mean,
Right.
these guys know each other very well.
They do. In fact, when David Mack was, I think it was either David Mack or Perez, when one of them was released on bond, the first place they went to was Chief Park's house. Okay.
What?
Yeah, straight there, straight from the jail to Park's house. Okay. So
Hold
definitely,
on, wait, say that again. I'm sorry. What?
that's okay. So when David Mack, I think I want to say David Mack because I'm pretty sure that you can check my math on this. Maybe you can do a little research to it, it's all out there. When David Mack got released, he got arrested for the bank robbery and he
Yes.
posted bond. He was out on bond. And the first thing he did when he got out of jail in that case was, usually you'd go home. He didn't go home. First place David Mack went was to Chief Bernard Park's house, his own personal residence. And they tracked
Whoa.
that because they were tracking him. They were following him, and they knew right where he went. But what do you do, and how do you tackle the issue when a guy that's a suspect in a you know felony bank robbery is buddies with the to the point where he's going to his home personal home, is
Well,
buddies
aren't there
with the chief
pictures
of
of
police.
I want to say Michelle Parks, his daughter, hanging out with these guys?
Well, there are, but I have not seen them. There allegedly are, but
Okay,
I have
okay.
I have not seen them. And nor can I confirm that Mac was the one who picked up Michelle Parks when she got arrested for drugs in Nevada, in Las Vegas,
Right.
Nevada.
I mean, that's
Uh,
almost secondary. Clearly, these two cats, the chief of police and David Mack, know each other well. Like I said, he
yep.
recruited him. Mack goes to his house after he's released on bond. I didn't know that part, but I mean,
Yeah.
this rabbit hole continues to go deep, man. As we wind down episode 3 here, we're pretty much saying LAPD is officially running interference for cops working with death row. We got Reggie, and we didn't really talk too much about this. Reggie converting many assets away from Suge, and the continuing doubling down on the Orlando Anderson narrative.
Yeah. I think, episode 3 of all the episodes, they keep running back and forth. They say, what's your favorite episode? What's your favorite episode? What's your favorite episode? I think the strength of episode 3 is that we're just putting the issue to bed. We're just putting the fact that you've got people with ulterior motives inside Death Row Records. Okay. Once you establish that you have people's whose motives are not Suge Knight's motives, clearly you don't take the property of somebody that
Right.
unless he's in on it and he swears he's not and it doesn't look like he was. That when you have somebody who's informing to the cops or the feds on their boss at Death Row Records, I mean, shit, Suge Knight gave him a job. Okay, gave him a job, allegedly at the behest of Reggie Sr. Gave him a job at Death Row Records, and what's the guy do with that responsibility and that favor? He turns around and starts routing all his information to the cops, to the FBI. Well, and then makes it clear to the FBI that he wants to take over Death Row Records. Maybe he thought that would be his reward for getting rid of Suge Knight.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, when you look at the killing of Tupac and you look at the shooting of Suge Knight, because take Tupac out of the vehicle, I say this all the time. Take Tupac out of the vehicle, and what do you have? You have the attempted murder of one of the most powerful men in the music industry at that time.
Right.
Period. Take Tupac out of it. You've got an attempted murder. Okay, well, when you start looking at who might be interested in doing it, you can say, oh, Pasha, it couldn't have been him. Well, wait a minute. If from the very beginning he's given a job and he shows everybody, and we put this to bed once and for all, he shows the world that he has no allegiance to his boss, the guy who gave him the job, and in fact wants to take over for the boss. And then you look
And
at
is smashing on his baby mama. You can't
right.
leave that.
Yes, but when you look at Reggie Wright and you say he had ulterior motives, he was already ratting out the guy who gave him a job, and he was informing and saying that he wanted to take over Death Row Records. And then you look at a shooting that involved Suge Knight and Tupac in a car, an attempted murder, and you go back to your list of suspects. Suddenly, a guy that was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, saying, "Oh no, I had no motive. How we were Suge and I, we were buddies." Blah 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 blah. And then you find out he's been ratting out Suge for years.
Right.
That changes
Years.
the entire narrative. That change, yeah, before Tupac.
Yeah.
That changes, in my mind, the entire history and narrative, and you now are forced to look at the quote unquote death row story a whole different way.
I wonder what Reggie did way back in the day, because like he says in the thing, I'm not that guy. I'm not that guy. But he's clearly been a Fed for a long time. I wonder what he did back in the day to get put on paper by the Feds the way he was and is.
Well, I think that I think that making yourself available as a source of information, because there's that old saying, the guy, you got two guys that committed a crime, Jeff. Okay, they both committed together. The first one that takes a deal is the one who wins. The other guy's fucked. Okay, he takes the deal, he rats on the other guy, he gets immunity, the other guy's fucked.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a certain strategic advantage, and ask your dad, who's a lieutenant on the Compton Police Department, if that makes any sense, who's been doing law enforcement for years. If you're the guy who puts that information out first and makes a deal and protects yourself, then you're not only are you invulnerable to them, are invulnerable to them looking the other way. In other words, they're going to look the other way. They're not going to look
Right.
at you. But you took the deal first. Anybody else that you give information to, including people that may just be your enemies, may not have done anything wrong. They may just be people you don't like. That you can level an allegation, use that same informant pipeline to start spilling fake beans on somebody else, and then suddenly somebody's in the cross of the DEA or the ATF. You know, I don't
Kind
know
of.
what the situation happened with Kevin Hackey, but somehow Kevin Hackey got jammed up with that ATF, with that gun charge that sent him to prison.
Then
And
he wound up selling his security company for like tens of millions of dollars. So he's
well,
doing all right.
that was years later, but the first
Yeah.
thing he
Yeah.
had to do was he had to go to jail, but then he had to appeal it, and of course he won on the appeal because it was a bad case to begin with. But again, like I'm saying, and I don't know what all the circumstances were as to how that all manifests itself, but if you got a guy who's willing to inform to the FBI, it's a strategic advantage and a position of power, I might say, Jeff.
And kind of going back to what you were saying about the Whitey Bulger, he
Yeah,
definitely
the God
leveraged that.
complex, the God
Yeah.
complex. Hey, it doesn't take me. I know I'm buddies with this Dan McMullen over here at the FBI. All I got to do is just say that so and so did something and I saw them doing something and now they got a case on the guy. You see what I mean?
Yeah,
That's a powerful freaking position to be
it
in.
is. It
And
is.
so if you want to take over Death Row Records and you want to get rid of Suge Knight and you want to be in a position where you get all that power and money and property and all that, the best thing you can do is put yourself in alignment with the guys that can put them away. Suge Knight said it the best.
Yeah.
You can take the man from the money, or you can take the money from the man.
Yes. I thought that was
One
pretty
way or
dope.
another.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it's been effective. And as we close out, man, Reggie says, and it's again, when you watch his body language, man, the dude's the dark cat, in my opinion. He's like, you just don't know me. You don't. You don't know what I'm capable of doing or not capable of doing. I mean, anybody can talk shit, and I'm sure there is a little bit of hyperbole in some of what he's talking, but yeah, that's Reggie's seen some shit. And he's done some shit,
Well,
and
he's kind of Kaiser Soze. I mean, he
I'm
okay.
sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with the limp and everything. He
Yes.
can't walk. If he could walk, he'd probably have a limp.
Good
But
analogy, bro.
but
Yeah.
he's the last person that you would think, because he had alleged all this loyalty to Suge for all these years and gone on so many rants. And how many videos have you seen where he calls other people snitches and how he would never do that and that, and makes such a big deal about it, to where Shakespeare said thou doth protest too much,
Right.
that he keeps going out there and saying that, and then coming to find out that not only is he a rat to the FBI, but he's been a rat for a long time, and with the intention, documented intention, of wanting to take over Death Row Records. It wasn't like he was doing it because, like you said, about I only testify against corrupt mayors. Okay, well, no, you testify against anybody that you think you might get an economic advantage about testifying to. And that is the wrong kind of snitch. There should be a third category, I think. The
Well,
triple
this winds
zeros.
down, this will wind down the breakdown of the Great Diversion. Man, it's absolutely wild. And this rabbit hole rolls very deep. Absolute power, as we see, corrupts absolutely.
Yep.
Um, RJ, thank you again for your time, my friend. Until next week, where we jump into episode 4.
It's on Zumo Play. Go watch it. Tupac cover up, Zumo Play. It's there for free. You can't bitch that it costs you anything.
Absolutely. The price is right, and that link will be in the description to this episode. Peace and so much love, guys. Take care. Stay tuned. You know what it is.
Hey,
There'll always be more.